Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to talk about the unmitigated joy that is the experience of driving on the road here in Portugal. Let me just preface this by saying that there are quite a lot of expats living in Portugal who routinely talk about how poor the quality of driving is here in Portugal, and lambasting it is almost like a pastime for some of these people on social occasions. It's one of those topics of conversation where you will get almost everybody in agreement with you if you bring it up. You say, oh yeah, this thing happened to me today on the road, the Portuguese driver did this, and everyone will say, yeah, it's really bad, it's terrible, they're shocking. Actually, I'm going to diverge from that a little bit and say that my experience of driving in Portugal has actually been pretty good. Now, perhaps that opinion is conditioned by my own personal driving history. Obviously, in my case, I was born and raised in the UK. I learned to drive in the UK and I drove there for a short period of time. But for most of my adult life, I've been living in Asia, specifically in China for a very long time, and also in Thailand, and I've driven in both of those places. And perhaps because of my experience of driving there, I tend to think that Portugal is actually pretty good when it comes to driving. Portugal, as you can see from this statistical map, is definitely not one of the safest destinations for driving in Europe, with basically 60 deaths per million of population in 2023. It's amongst the worst of the countries in Europe. It's not the absolute worst, but definitely there is a difference between Portugal and even countries like Spain and France, but especially the Scandinavian countries or places like Britain or Ireland. And that definitely indicates that driving in Portugal is a little bit more dangerous. And of the accidents that I've seen here, they do tend to be bad ones. You know, they've got like ambulances and multiple police cars and traffic stopped and that kind of thing. It's a sharp contrast to what I experienced in China, where most accidents are kisses. You know, the car's just been scratched and yet you've got like 15 people standing around it for 2 hours arguing about who's going to pay for the scratch. No, unfortunately in Portugal, it tends to be a little bit more severe when there's an accident, maybe because of how fast people are going. But if you also look at the statistics here, you can see Portugal has made a significant improvement, and the number of fatalities on the road in the period 2013 to 2023 dropped significantly. Now, it's not as great progress as some other countries, and I'm not trying to make the case that Portugal is setting the world on fire for road safety or anything like that. And obviously these statistics really just look at fatalities. They don't look at accidents or other kind of injuries. But based on this, Portugal is not the worst, and it is making progress. I think we can say that. Of course, Portugal is not without its driving annoyances, and there are several habits of Portuguese drivers which I can understand that some people might take issue with, and we'll talk about in a moment. And there are also complaints maybe related to the general conditions of driving in Portugal, you know, things like the roads, for example, and we'll also touch on them. So, first up, probably the biggest complaint that you get about Portuguese drivers is that they drive too fast and it's so dangerous. Actually, in my own experience, I haven't found this. Yes, there are people who drive relatively quickly here, but it's nothing that I regard as like supremely dangerous. Usually the people who make these kind of comments are the guys that think that driving at 40 kilometers an hour is like the acceptable rate, you know, to avoid any kind of accident or problem. And to be honest, in my own opinion, those guys are more annoying than the guys that drive quickly. But that's just the way I see it. One thing that I will say about this issue is that while I don't have a problem with people driving fast on, you know, open roads or on highways or whatever, on very small, narrow country roads where the visibility around corners just isn't there because you have hedges and walls and twists and turns, I have found in my own area that there are certain local people who tend to drive very quickly around those corners. And very quickly isn't that fast in the scheme of things. It may only be like 50 kilometers an hour or something. But when you only have a very short stopping distance available, and when you actually can't see what's around the corner, 50 kilometers an hour is pretty rapid. And because I've had several very bad experiences, I had several near accidents with a couple of people, I now creep around those bends and I will often use my horn. At night it's actually better because everybody has the lights on and you can see people coming, but during the day is actually when it gets most dangerous because you literally cannot see what's around the bend and people will still belt around it at like a reasonable speed, and the road is so narrow, you can't pass. Somebody has to go into like a lay-by or onto a bit of the grass or something to get by. So if two cars are coming at 50 round that corner, then there's probably going to be a collision there. So it's something I don't like and I wish people would stop. The next thing that people tend to mention is tailgating, the idea that Portuguese drivers have a tendency to drive very, very close to the vehicle in front. If the vehicle that's in front is driving too slowly, in their opinion, they get super, super close to it, and sometimes it seems very aggressive, like they're trying to force you to go faster. To be honest, I've seen this, but I haven't personally experienced it. Maybe because I drive relatively fast myself, so I haven't been, a victim of tailgating. But I do see it and I think to myself, whoa, those cars are really close together. It's almost like a magnetic attraction going on there. But who's really at fault? Obviously the guy behind shouldn't be driving that close. It is dangerous, I know it, it's true. However, what's the person in front doing? I mean, in most cases that I've seen, it's some guy who's driving like 40 kilometers an hour in a 60 or 70 kilometer hour zone. That just isn't good behaviour, not in my opinion anyway. If I was being followed really closely by another car, if there was another car which I recognise as wanting to go faster behind me, what would I do? Well, what I would do is I would slow down, indicate, give him as much space as possible to pass, maybe roll down the window and flag him to go through. I would make it easy for him to overtake me. What I wouldn't do is sit there like a slow-moving obstacle and waste like 15 minutes of his day, because on Portuguese roads in the countryside, there are very few overtaking opportunities. And some of the overtaking opportunities I have to wonder about why they were created, because they strike me as so dangerous to overtake there that I would never do it. So if you're stuck behind somebody who's moving very, very slowly, you might be there for some time. And it really is a very frustrating experience. So I think, yes, tailgating is dangerous. But on the other hand, the people who are driving so slowly along the road, and this is, I think, the majority of the tailgating situations are caused by this, they should respond in a kind of socially responsible manner and try to let the other people get past as easily as possible so that this situation just doesn't exist. Another thing that I have seen in Portugal, and this one does infuriate me because, as I just mentioned, the roads in some places are very, very narrow. Two cars can't pass in parallel, so somebody has to pull over to the side of the road to let the other one through. This is in the countryside. And I have been behind somebody and he just stopped. Stopped when he saw someone he knew and had a talk with the guy for like 2 or 3 minutes. And he thinks, that's fine. Well, obviously that isn't fine. And when I honked my horn at him to get him going again, he gave me a dirty look, I felt that I'd been more than tolerant in that situation, but he's basically blocking the road. And just so that he can say hi to somebody that he knows. I think that that's really, really selfish behaviour. And for me, that's one of the worst things that I've seen here in Portugal. Roundabout behaviour is another interesting one, and to be honest, it does kind of bother me. There are a couple of things here. Most Portuguese drivers, according to my observation, do not like to use indicators when they're tackling a roundabout. So you don't know where they're going, and when they're coming out of the roundabout, you just don't know. So if you're waiting to join the flow of traffic and you see a car coming round, you basically have to wait there because you don't know where he's going, if he's going to be proceeding or whether he's going to be turning off. So it's a little bit irritating in that regard. Another source of problem is that quite a lot of drivers here, they don't really recognize your right of way. Like if you're already in the roundabout and you're going around it, you know, that guy who's wanting to come into the roundabout should wait for you to proceed and then follow you. But no, many of them would just come out. You know, it's kind of like they've got enough time, in their opinion, they will accelerate and you have to brake in response to that. And to be honest, no, I really don't love that. Parking is just a classic thing here. I mean, there are many drivers who are good parkers. I don't want to take that away from them, but there are quite a few people who park in bizarre ways. Like if you're in a supermarket car park or something like that, you know, it's very frequent to see people who are well over the lines. And some of them even park at like 45-degree angles and occupy 2 or even 3 spaces. It's just incredible to me that people could do that. If you're talking about the city, like when I lived in Coimbra, double parking was very much a thing, especially around restaurants or places where many people go. And you would routinely see 2 or even 3 rows of cars parked there on the road with no way for the people to get out. If I was the victim of that, fortunately I didn't drive while I was in Coimbra. I was walking around the city because I didn't need to drive, so I didn't get a car then. But if I was the victim of that, I would be absolutely furious. But there doesn't seem to be all that much road rage here. I mean, I haven't witnessed too many altercations in all the time that I lived in Coimbra walking past these kind of situations. I've never seen people like getting into a fight over, you know, double parking. It just doesn't seem to happen. One thing I really have trouble with, and this is another source of near accidents for me. You know, there have been 2 sources of near accidents. One is coming around the blind bend on these narrow countryside roads. The other one is in parking lots. Now, there seems to be a tendency here for many drivers to just come out. You know, they are in their parking bay, they want to leave, and whether they're coming out front first or whether they're backing out, and most of them are backing out, they don't seem to pay attention to if there are other vehicles, you know, coming that have the right of way, and they'll just come out. And sometimes it causes near accidents. I remember I was in the Pingo Doce car park about a couple of weeks ago. I had one lady who backed out almost into me. And once I got round her, I proceeded forward and I had another guy who came out front first and almost hit me. And that was in the space of 30 seconds. So you have to be very, very cautious when you're parking in car parks, especially supermarket car parks in my experience. And what I tend to do is I park far away from the entrance because there are fewer cars around there and it just makes life easier to avoid these kind of situations. Distracted driving is very much a thing in Portugal, but I think it's somewhat of a worldwide phenomenon. You know, in China and Thailand, it's even worse than it is here. It's not uncommon to see people fiddling about with their mobile phones, sending text messages or calling people without hands-free. You know, they've got the phone up at their ear. That is quite a common thing. And some of these people are driving at speed. There are other instances where people are fiddling about with other things in the car. Like I came across a lady driving and she had like 3 kids and she was driving along the road very, very slowly, causing a traffic jam, approximately 20 kilometers an hour. I was the car behind her and she was basically having some kind of altercation with her kids in the car while she was moving forward. And yeah, I think distracted driving, it's fair to say that it does happen here. I haven't seen any accidents happen because of it, but I dare say they do. A lot of people complain about poor lane discipline here and drivers drifting from one lane to the other when they're on the highway. In my experience, I don't often go on the highway because there are toll roads, which I'll come to later. I haven't found it. My experience of driving on the Portuguese highways is simply that they have been great. There are people who drive tremendously fast there, but they didn't cause me any problems, so I don't really care about it. I haven't had problems with people cutting in front of me, as some people talk about, or just drifting across like 3 lanes. I haven't seen it. I haven't come across it. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not a major problem. Another thing that kind of bothers me, and this may be because I lived in China for so long, and I'll explain why. When you're traveling down the road with the right of way and there's a junction with another road, there's a stop sign, a line, and the other driver who wants to come onto the road that you're on should stop there. In that kind of situation, quite a lot of drivers in Portugal come to a stop very, very fast and very, very late, well over the line. Now, I have frequently thought, oh my God, I'm going to have an accident here, and I've swerved to the other side to avoid this guy. But actually, they do eventually stop. They stop far too late, but they do stop. Now, why did I relate this back to China? It's because in China, that guy would be coming. He wouldn't stop. He's coming out. You have to stop for him. That's the way it works there. It's not the law, but that's the way it works there. If you see someone doing that in China, you better stop because there will be an accident. So I have that kind of inbuilt response to swerve or stop when I see this kind of behavior. But yeah, they do tend to hit the junction really rapidly and come to a very late stop, which are well over the lines. As a pedestrian in Portugal, I've generally had very good experiences. In Coimbra, I find that the vast majority of drivers respect pedestrian crossings and things like that, zebra crossings. It's really pretty good. The only bad thing I've had is actually around my local area. When I've been out walking, there aren't such good sidewalks along the countryside roads. So you're basically walking on the verge of the road, basically. It's like a grassy verge. Or along the road itself when there's no traffic. When I've been walking along the verge of the road, I've been clipped by the mirror of a car on one occasion and kind of grazed by it on the second occasion. And this is a reasonably sized road. It's the kind of road that 2 cars can pass each other comfortably on. There's no traffic on the road, basically, or very, very little. Use 1 car at a time and then wait for 10-15 seconds, you might see another one. So there's absolutely no excuse for a car to be that close to a pedestrian. But it has happened. I was not injured, but it did clip my arm. It was no big deal, a little bit painful, but nothing that I didn't recover from. That guy, by the way, I presume it's a guy, he didn't stop, he just continued on his merry way. Moving on to talk about things that irritate me and a lot of other people. I'm sure many Portuguese drivers are irritated by these things as well. First of all would be toll roads. The toll roads are brilliant. I mean, they're really good. They're very quiet. People don't go on them all that often because they're toll roads, and the tolls are quite expensive in Portugal. I'm not complaining about the state of them. What I take issue with is the fact that there are so many toll roads. Why should we have to pay as drivers when we already pay so much in IUC? The tax on gasoline is quite high, and just taxes in general, the fiscal burden in Portugal is definitely not low. Why is it that we're paying for toll roads? I don't really understand it or think that it's acceptable. A problem which is connected to, the presence of toll roads is that because all the good roads are toll roads, it forces commercial operators, I'm talking about like small trucks and big trucks here, onto smaller roads, country roads and national roads. So you find that these roads are damaged more often. They have more potholes because they have such heavy vehicles traversing them. And also the traffic flow isn't good. I mean, you've got big heavy trucks moving slowly. down very narrow country roads sometimes. It can be difficult to get past them. You can't overtake, and even if you're oncoming traffic, it can be difficult in some cases. So I think the presence of the toll road situation in Portugal really causes this to happen, because the operators of logistics companies, etc., just don't want to pay the tolls because they're so high, especially for these larger vehicles. And it creates these situations on the smaller roads. And to be honest, I really don't love it. And lastly, there are quite a lot of roads that have very, very poor overtaking opportunities in Portugal, especially in the countryside. It can be basically impossible to get past somebody for like 5 minutes or something when you're driving down the road. There are signs saying no overtaking, and even when overtaking is allowed, a lot of people, including myself, would just judge it to be too dangerous to overtake there. I mean, I don't want to overtake on a blind rise or round a corner. It's allowed, but I don't want to do it. So yeah, when you get slow drivers, and there are quite a lot of slow drivers in Portugal as well as fast drivers, they can basically be like a bottleneck, and you're stuck behind them for a protracted period of time. So on the smaller roads in Portugal, you can definitely spend a lot of frustrating minutes, especially in rural areas. You know, you get a lot of tractors and agricultural vehicles that are moving tremendously slowly, and you can be stuck behind them for minutes and minutes and minutes. It's really not a fantastic experience. Just to finish on a positive note, I do think that there are some things about driving in Portugal that I think are very, very good. For example, drivers tend to be courteous to one another. You know, especially in my area, you get a lot of people who wave to each other. People will let other people out as a courtesy. That is really good. Now, if you think about the UK situation or something like that, it's the same. But if you compare that to driving in Asia, it's definitely not that. You know, if you're talking about driving in China, there's no courtesy. There's just a me first aggressive attitude when you're driving there. If you're not fast, you're last. I'm going and screw you, basically, is the attitude. So it's nice to come back to Europe and see people doing that kind of thing again. Another thing is there's very little use of horn in Portugal. You don't often hear people honking the horn at other people in frustration. It's a big feature of driving in places like India, Vietnam, China. You know, in China, I used to go through a horn per year. I had to replace it because I used it that much. It's necessary to use it there just for safety. But here you don't hear it, and on the occasions where I've gotten annoyed and pressed the horn, I usually get a dirty look from a Portuguese driver that that's like a socially unacceptable thing to do. So in general, just to wrap up, how do I feel about driving in Portugal? To be honest, I feel good about it. Yes, there are some minor inconveniences, most of them around parking or the roads in the countryside not allowing enough overtaking. But in general, I think standards of driving here are all right. I don't have an immense problem with them, and I kind of differ from the majority of expats in my take on this situation. All right, well, I hope people found this video interesting and informative. I enjoyed making it, and I will see you soon in the next one.